So, on to our final talk of the day, and it is my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Mark Makepeace, who is CEO of the global index provider FTSE Russell, and also Group Director of Information Services at London Stock Exchange. He's going to be joined in conversation by Yacob Peterseil, who's editor at Bloomberg covering ETFs and structured products. And he's going to be asking Mark for his perspective on the indexing space as it is today, as well as looking ahead at where some of the key trends are heading. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Yacob Peterseil. I'm an editor at Bloomberg, and I'm thrilled to be here this evening with Mark Makepeace. Now, before we get into the Q&A, which is actually just a polite word for interrogation, Mark, I wanted to share an anecdote that I came across recently that I think will provide a frame for our conversation and show just how far the indexing business has grown in the last couple of decades. So, the year is 2015. We were in Lima, Peru. The Peruvian finance minister is going about his day there in the capital when he gets an urgent phone call from a senior government official telling him to drop everything, pack his bags, grab a couple of guys from the central bank, a couple of officials from the Peruvian securities regulator, and catch the first plane to New York. Now, it isn't a matter of statehood that the minister has been called to, and it wasn't a diplomatic spat that he needed to resolve. Someone had heard a rumor that MSCI was going to downgrade Peru from its widely followed EM index, upending the finance minister's week so that he could rush to New York and argue against this happening. Now, that anecdote from a Bloomberg story from a couple of years ago, I think, is a nice illustration of the increasingly important role indexers like FTSE play today, and which we'll get into with Mark this evening. But before we do, why don't we start at the beginning, Mark? You left the London Stock Exchange in '95 to found FTSE when it had just 9 people on staff.
Right. That's right.
Now, what was it about the indexing business you saw that made you think that's where I want to be?
I think at that time we could see that things were going to change, from the UK point of view, what I could see was that the index world was, first of all, it was going to be global. It had to reach beyond any single exchange, and therefore I certainly felt the need that to be able to grow and be successful, we had to be outside the confines of a stock exchange at that time, because providing stock indices for just a single country was going to be very limiting. And really, what we needed to do was to provide global benchmarks, not single country benchmarks. So that was really what drove me to think, look, if we are going to do this, then we need to set it up in a way which allows it to grow and provide a service to investors globally. I also saw in the Financial Times, which were they were working with Goldman Sachs and a bank called County NatWest at the time, for those who can remember. At that time, they were providing a global series of indices for UK fund managers and being very successful working with the actuaries in the UK, but they were only being successful in the UK. So they had more sort of international mandates in the UK for UK-based funds, but that was really the market they were addressing. And I saw the opportunity there to actually globalize and provide a global service. But when we did start, there were just 9 of us. So maybe there was also a touch of naivety in believing that you could grow a global business quickly. But we were sort of very fortunate, and with the backing of a few big asset owners who adopted us early, we have grown and grown. And today, FTSE has something like $16 trillion that we can identify that follows their indices. That's more than any other index provider. Now that's spread across a range of indices, but that's a huge sum of money that follows us. So yes, when governments do want to attract international investors into their market, and they have to want to do that, then they're very keen to talk to us. But our role is not to represent those companies or countries. Our role is to represent the end investors. And I think that's very important. If we continue to represent the interests of the end investors, then we will continue to attract more assets which follow us, and as more assets follow us, then we have more influence. But that means we just have to be extra careful in making sure the way we act and the standards we create are those which are acceptable to those end investors.
And you do, as you mentioned, have an enormous influence on some of these countries, and particularly, say, emerging markets, frontier markets. Is this the kind of responsibility you ever envisioned having, and do you think you're in the right position to have this sort of responsibility?
I don't think we set out with that as an intent. And I don't think we see it as, if we serve the end investors, they will continue to use us. If we stop serving them in the right way, or the way in which they want us to serve them, they will stop using us. So it's not as though if we make a decision that they disagree with, then they will not necessarily follow it. And they put enormous pressure on us to make the right decisions. And often there is a debate that goes backwards and forwards between us and the community of large asset owners to try and change rules, adapt rules, for the future and to meet their needs. If we don't do that, it's the competition between us and MSCI is very fierce. But if both of us don't do it, they will take their business somewhere else. So I'm not sure we have the power that I think the media would like to associate with us. I'm not sure we want that power either. But I think if we serve those end investors in the right way, they will put more assets against what we do.
In another, as you'll know, I think last week MSCI decided against kicking out companies with multiple share classes from their indexes.
Yeah.
I think FTSE has barred new entrants, but given existing ones until 2022 to...
Yeah, no, we introduced the rule, and the problem was this, is that companies coming to the market with no voting rights means that that's a huge risk for the investors taking on those companies. And what happened was Snap came to the market. It was going to be a sizable company. The shares, there were no voting rights with the shares. You were in complete control of the management. So our big client base in the US, the big asset owners there, all reached out to FTSE immediately and said, look, this represents unacceptable risk to us, and we do not think it's right that companies with no voting rights should be included in the benchmark, because if we as passive investors against the benchmark, we would be forced buyers of that, or else we would have you define the indices in a different way. So we consulted the industry on this, and it was quite clear that the overwhelming majority of asset owners did not want to include companies that had restricted voting rights, not just no voting rights, restricted voting rights. But the fund management community were very nervous of changing indices. And the logic for their nervousness was that there are so many shares and major companies in the market today around the world which restrict their voting rights in some shape or form, that actually you were distorting the benchmark. The benchmark would no longer represent what would be the investable opportunity set. If exclude a small number of companies and a small percentage of the market, I think that's about setting standards. As soon as we start excluding 10% of the market, then the benchmark no longer represents the opportunity set. And that was the issue we then had to wrestle with. Now, we reached a compromise with the our client base, which said we would put a minimum 5%. And why 5%? Because that's our minimum free flow eligibility to be considered to be included in the indices. So we said if at least 5% of your shares were not voting, you would not be eligible. Now, that excluded Snap and got the support of the asset owners globally. But we said at the time to go beyond that, to make that 25% or more, was going to be too big a step, simply because it would start to distort the index in terms of its representation of the investable opportunity set. Now, there were lots of differing views, but in the end, that was the sort of consensus we built. Now, MSCI didn't make a change at that time. They made a bigger statement that they would change the indices in a much bigger way, and I think they got so much pushback, they've come to a conclusion of not any change, or you can have a special index. So, I mean, we're both trying to tackle the same problem. That's not a criticism of MSCI. We're both trying to tackle the same problem, but we've come at it slightly differently, but got to a fairly similar answer in the end.
You alluded to this earlier. How much do you pay attention to what MSCI and S&P are doing? Do you think there should be uniformity among the big benchmarks, or are you happy to go out on a limb with FTSE?
No, I think it's important we all compete. And actually, we don't watch MSCI to see what MSCI is doing at all. In fact, we do the opposite. We almost ignore what MSCI is doing. What we do is we talk to the asset owner community in particular, but we talk to the client base all the time. Now, if MSCI comes up with something which that community likes, that community says we also want FTSE to do that. But what we do is we focus on that community. Our role is to service that community in the best possible way we can. So it's how do we understand what they want, and how do we constantly improve what we do to meet their needs. Now, if MSCI gets ahead of us in doing that, clearly that community tells us, and that's what drives the competition.
And speaking of competition, it's obviously not just MSCI and S&P anymore. Some of your clients are becoming competitors. Firms like BlackRock and State Street have started self-indexing, potentially reducing their reliance on firms like FTSE. How seriously do you take that threat?
Yeah, I'm not sure they're reducing their reliance, but I think we are seeing, I think Larry referred to it, enormous change in the intermediary space. And you could argue index providers like us are competing with fund managers. We don't manage money, but if you think about what we do, you know, look, most of the big asset owners, they're managing more and more money in-house, and they come to us and they tell us what strategies they want to follow. You know, we'll design and give you any sort of multi-factor based approach tilted for sustainability or any other characteristics that any other quant shop can do. But we just provide it as an index. Now, many of the asset owners, that gives them the opportunity then to have custom approaches. It allows them to manage the money in-house. And one of the things we do is we're reducing the cost of investing. We haven't set out to compete with fund management, but in some ways we do that. What we try to do is work closely with fund management so that, you know, we're never going to run money, but we work with fund management in the same way, where we produce the same approaches to meet their needs. Well, the in-house build or the self-build, often what we find is it's not about trying to reduce cost, it's about trying to have something that differentiates or keeps that sort of exclusivity. And people like us have had to change our model from everything we do we own to actually being more flexible in allowing people, if they want to differentiate themselves, That's fine. We can design that in a way, we don't have to repeat it. The only thing we're nervous about is many of the differentiation is actually on the fringes, and we don't want to get ourselves into a position where the differentiation isn't sufficient and we're caught in some legal argument as to who owns what. So that's the only area we're nervous. Otherwise, I think we're quite comfortable with working with the industry, and it's a lot cheaper to work with someone like us than do it themselves. And in fact, a lot of what you hear is self-indexed. You'll find one of us is doing the calculation anyway.
And you had mentioned that this sort of custom and proprietary nature of some of these indexes. On the regulatory front, that's given rise to some rumblings, for example, at the SEC, about instituting greater oversight of indexers, potentially as investment advisors, given that the blurring of these lines between indexation and asset management. Do you think your business should be subject to greater regulatory oversight?
Well, we're being regulated now in the EU. The EU has introduced benchmark regulation, and there are benefits of that. I would say it's bringing a much more disciplined approach to indexation. I think it makes me a little bit nervous is because it does create barriers to competition, and actually I believe competition is good, for the industry and everyone within it. But I do think whether or not we like it, we are going to see greater regulation. But I hope that greater regulation just means, higher quality service and more discipline, and doesn't end up with restrictions and barriers which prevent competition. I also get a bit nervous is because I think we may see more innovation happening outside the regulated areas, because regulators, aren't so comfortable with innovation. And I think we'll see more innovation that's done outside of Europe because of the EU benchmark regulation.
And on the great passive versus active debate, how seriously do you take this theoretical possibility that, given the growth of passive investing, one day all money will be indexed? Do you think that could actually happen?
I don't think that will happen. And also, I think you have to ask yourself, what do you mean by index? If you think of, in the old days, we used to think of indexation as really just being cap-weighted indices. If I think about the majority of new indices we're doing today and where the money's going, it's into indices which are following active strategies. So really, yes, there's a growth in what's indexed, but actually a growing proportion of those funds are actually active strategies that we're just putting in an index wrapper. So I'm not sure. If the level of cap-weighted indexation, gets too high, you would expect that active managers and active strategies should be able to outperform, and you would expect the market to naturally see that change.
You've said you want to grow the amount following your products, which is around 16 trillion today, as you said, in 3 years to 20 trillion. Mm-hmm. How do you do that?
Well, I think if we're listening to the asset owners correctly and what they want us to do, it's moving to multi-asset approaches, particularly into alternatives. Think about private equity. We recently acquired the Citi Global Bond Indices, and as we're modernising that, we're finding great demand there. We currently have something like 4 trillion benchmarked against our fixed income indices, and we expect that to grow quite substantially. So we can see routes to 20, 25 trillion, and I think that's very, very achievable.
And a more personal, sort of reflective question to conclude. What are you proudest of having accomplished since 1995, starting FTSE? What warms your heart the most to have done?
Yeah, at heart, I'm still a sort of product person. So and something I pushed for a long time was ESG. So actually, what's really pleasing for me is actually seeing that investors are now beginning to adapt their benchmarks and their investment portfolios to actually include ESG seriously. And I think that's only going to speed up. So, having created FTSE for Good just to get the subject really out there, whereas today now, I think ESG is just becoming a standard part of our benchmark discussions. So that's probably one of the areas I would say gives me greatest pleasure.
Great. I think Mark will be around later to take any other questions. But Mark, thank you very much for your time. It's been great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, hello. Thank you very much, Mark and Yacob, for this. So we're now close